He was always rough around the edges, but everyone forgave him everything. I thought I was just unlucky. Then I opened a folder of documents and understood why he was always special to Mom, and I wasn't. Growing up in our house felt like living in someone else's shadow every single day. From the moment I could form memories, everything revolved around him. The golden boy who could do no wrong, even when he was doing everything wrong. I remember being maybe 6 years old, standing in the kitchen while Mom unpacked grocery bags, watching her pull out his favorite cereal, his favorite snacks, the expensive name-brand stuff. Then she'd toss the generic version my way without even looking. It wasn't malicious, just automatic, like feeding the family dog the cheaper kibble. The pattern was so consistent it became my normal. When report cards came home, his B- in math got celebrated with ice cream and praise for trying his best. My A- in the same subject got a brief nod and a comment about how I should focus more on making friends instead of just studying all the time. When we both wanted to join Little League, there was suddenly only enough money in the budget for one registration fee. Guess who got to play ball that summer while I sat in the bleachers keeping score? But it was the small, daily cruelties that really wore me down. The way he'd eat the last piece of pizza without asking if anyone else wanted it. How he'd use up all the hot water for his shower, knowing I still needed to get ready for school. The casual way he'd borrow my things without permission and return them broken or not at all. My bike became his bike whenever his friends were around and he wanted to look cool. My favorite books disappeared into his room and came back with torn pages and coffee stains. The worst part was how everyone acted like this was just normal sibling dynamics. When I complained, I got lectures about sharing and being a good sport. When he took my Halloween candy and traded it all for something he wanted more, Mom said it taught me valuable lessons about negotiation and compromise. When he broke my science project the night before it was due, Dad spent 3 hours helping him fix it while I scrambled to start over from scratch. School wasn't any better because his reputation preceded me everywhere. Teachers would light up when they saw my last name on their roster, expecting another charming, outgoing student like my brother. Instead, they got me quiet, serious, always trying too hard to prove I belonged. His friends treated me like an annoying little pest, useful only for fetching things or running errands. My own classmates seemed to think I was lucky to be related to someone so popular, like his social status should somehow make up for how he treated me at home. The dynamic got even worse as we hit our teenage years. Suddenly, every rule in the house had exceptions carved out specifically for him. Curfew was flexible when he had important social events. Chores could be postponed when he had practice or plans with friends. His grades started slipping, but Mom made excuses about how he was naturally brilliant and just bored by school. Meanwhile, I was expected to maintain perfect attendance, stellar marks, and handle most of the household responsibilities without complaint. I started keeping a mental tally of all the injustices, like some kind of cosmic accountant documenting every slight and favoritism. The time he dented Dad's car backing out of the driveway, and somehow I got blamed for leaving my skateboard behind the tire. The Christmas when his gift pile was 3 times the size of mine, with expensive electronics and designer clothes while I unwrapped socks and school supplies. The family vacation where we had to change our destination at the last minute because he decided he'd rather go somewhere his friends were going to. By 16, I was basically invisible in my own home. I could go entire days without anyone asking how school went or what I was up to. I'd come home to find them all laughing together in the living room, some inside joke I wasn't part of, and the conversation would awkwardly shift when I walked in. I started spending more time at the library and after-school activities, anywhere that felt less suffocating than being surrounded by people who were supposed to love me but treated me like an obligation. The breaking point came during my junior year when I needed my birth certificate for my driver's license application. Such a simple, ordinary task that somehow became this huge production. Mom kept saying she'd find it later, that she was too busy to dig through old paperwork right now. Dad suggested I just wait until the weekend when they'd have more time to help. But I was 17 and tired of waiting for permission to exist in my own life. So I went up to the attic on a Tuesday afternoon when everyone was out. The space was cramped and dusty, filled with Christmas decorations and boxes of outgrown clothes. I found several containers labeled with different years, thinking maybe the documents were organized chronologically. Most of the boxes contained exactly what you'd expect: old tax returns, expired warranties, school photos from elementary years that made me cringe. But then I found the manila folder tucked behind a box of my grandmother's china. It was thicker than the others, sealed with rubber bands that left marks on the yellowed edges. Inside were documents I'd never seen before, official-looking papers with letterheads from law offices and government agencies, guardianship papers with signatures I recognized, DNA test results printed on laboratory stationery, court documents discussing custody arrangements and family circumstances. My hands started shaking as I read through page after page of legal documentation that completely rewrote my understanding of my own life. The dates told a story I'd never imagined. He was 15 when I was born. 15. Still a kid himself, probably terrified and overwhelmed by circumstances he wasn't ready to handle. The woman I'd called Mom my entire life was actually my grandmother, who'd made the decision to raise me as her own son rather than let anyone know her teenage son had gotten someone pregnant. Everything suddenly made horrifying sense. The way he looked at me with irritation instead of brotherly affection. The distance I'd always felt from Mom, like there was some invisible barrier between us that I could never cross. The preferential treatment that seemed so unfair but was actually her trying to parent her actual child while managing the complicated situation of raising his child too. I wasn't just the less favored sibling. I was a living reminder of his mistake, a secret the whole family had built their lives around keeping. The medical records were the most devastating part. Details about the pregnancy, the birth, decisions made about my future while I was still tiny and helpless. Names I didn't recognize, presumably my biological mother who'd somehow been written out of the equation entirely. Social services paperwork discussing what was best for everyone involved. Everyone except the baby who'd grow up not knowing the truth about his own identity. I sat in that dusty attic for hours, reading and rereading documents until my eyes burned and my throat felt raw from breathing in old dust and trying not to cry. The timeline of my childhood replayed in my mind with this new context, every rejection and slight taking on deeper meaning. Of course he resented me. Of course she struggled to love me the same way. I wasn't her son. I was her grandson, a responsibility she'd taken on to protect her real child's reputation and future. Update 1. That night was the longest of my life. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the familiar sounds of the house, the way the refrigerator hummed, how the floorboards creaked when someone walked to the bathroom, the distant noise of late-night television from downstairs. Everything looked the same but felt completely different, like I was seeing my entire world through new glasses that made everything sharp and painful. I kept thinking about all the times I'd wished I belonged somewhere else, imagined what it would be like to have parents who actually wanted me around. The bitter irony was that I'd been living with my biological father the whole time, and he wanted me around even less than I'd realized. Every eye roll, every dismissive comment, every time he'd made me feel small and worthless, it all came from a place of genuine resentment, not just typical sibling rivalry. The next morning, I couldn't even look at any of them during breakfast. He sat there eating cereal and scrolling through his phone, completely oblivious to the fact that his entire secret had been exposed. Mom, grandmother, bustled around the kitchen making lunches and reminding everyone about their schedules for the day. Dad sat reading the newspaper, probably completely unaware of the deception that had shaped our family for 17 years. I went through the motions of getting ready for school, but my mind was spinning with questions I didn't know how to ask. Who was my biological mother? Where was she now? Did she know I existed? Or had she been convinced to give up all rights when she was probably just a scared teenager herself? Had anyone ever considered what I might want to know about my own origins? School was a blur of classes I couldn't focus on and conversations I couldn't follow. My friends noticed I was off, asking if I was feeling sick or if something had happened at home. How could I even begin to explain that my entire identity had been a lie? That the person I'd been competing with for parental attention was actually my parent, and he'd been losing that competition on purpose because I reminded him of the worst mistake of his adolescence? The hardest part was realizing how many signs I'd missed over the years. The way distant relatives would sometimes look confused when they saw us together, like they were trying to work out family resemblances that didn't quite add up. How Mom would get uncomfortable when people commented on how different we looked, quickly changing the subject or making jokes about mailmen and milkmen. The family photos where the age gap seemed weird if you really thought about them, but nobody ever really thought about them. I started paying attention to details I'd never noticed before. The way he avoided being alone with me, like he was afraid of what might slip out in unguarded moments. How Mom would sometimes look at me with this expression I couldn't identify, not quite guilt, not quite sadness, but something complicated and painful. The way certain topics were off limits in our house, like teen pregnancy or adoption or family planning, conversations that would die quick deaths whenever they started. By the end of that first week, I was barely sleeping and couldn't eat much of anything. I'd lost weight and developed dark circles under my eyes that made me look older and more worn down. My grades started slipping because I couldn't concentrate on anything except this massive secret that had been kept from me my entire life. I felt angry and betrayed and confused all at once, like every emotion was fighting for space in my chest. The worst part was the loneliness. I couldn't talk to anyone about what I discovered because it felt too big and too complicated to put into words. My friends wouldn't understand the magnitude of finding out your whole family dynamic was based on a lie. I couldn't confront the people involved because I wasn't supposed to know any of it. I was trapped with this knowledge, carrying around the weight of everyone else's choices and secrets. I started making plans to leave as soon as I turned 18. Not dramatic plans, just practical ones. I researched colleges far away, looked into student loans and work-study programs, calculated how much money I'd need to save for deposits and first month's rent. The idea of staying in that house for even one more year felt impossible now that I knew the truth. But then something unexpected happened that changed everything again. Update 2. 3 weeks after my discovery, I was coming home from school when I noticed an unfamiliar car in our driveway. Not unusual. My brother often had friends over, and Mom sometimes had colleagues stop by for work-related discussions. But something about this particular afternoon felt different, more tense, like the air itself was holding its breath. I walked through the front door to find everyone sitting in the living room in positions that looked too formal, too arranged. Mom was perched on the edge of the couch, her hands folded in her lap in a way that meant she was nervous. Dad sat in his recliner but wasn't reclined, sitting forward with his elbows on his knees. My brother was standing by the window, looking out at the street like he was planning an escape route. And then there was the woman I'd never seen before, sitting in the chair usually reserved for guests, looking remarkably like me around the eyes and the shape of her nose. She was maybe in her early 30s, dressed professionally but not stiffly, with hair that had been styled carefully like she'd prepared for this moment. When she saw me, her breath caught in a way that made my stomach drop. The silence stretched until Mom finally spoke, her voice higher and more strained than usual. She introduced the woman by name and said she was someone who'd been part of our family a long time ago, someone who'd been hoping to reconnect. The explanation was vague and awkward, full of pauses and meaningful looks between the adults that excluded me entirely. But I already knew who she was. The resemblance was too strong, and the timing was too coincidental. This was my biological mother, the missing piece of the puzzle I'd been trying to solve since finding those documents in the attic. She was younger than I'd expected, probably because she'd been so young when I was born. She looked nervous but determined, like someone who'd spent years working up the courage for this moment. The conversation that followed was stilted and uncomfortable, full of careful phrases and diplomatic language that skirted around the real issues. She'd apparently been trying to make contact for several years, but had been told it wasn't a good time, that it would be too disruptive, that everyone had moved on and it would be better to leave things as they were. But she persisted, and apparently recent changes in her life had given her the resources and confidence to push harder for this meeting. What I learned over the next several hours completely rewrote my understanding of the situation again. She hadn't abandoned me or given me up willingly. She'd been 16 and scared, pressured by both families to let his parents handle everything quietly. She'd wanted to be involved in my life, had tried to maintain contact, but had been gradually pushed out through a combination of legal maneuvering and social pressure that convinced her she'd be disrupting my stability. For years she'd been sending letters and cards that I'd never received, child support payments that apparently went into some kind of trust fund I'd never known existed, and gifts for birthdays and holidays that never made it to me. She'd gone back to school, gotten a degree, established a stable career, and had been hoping to reconnect when I was old enough to make my own decisions about relationships. The revelation that I'd had another parent out there all along, someone who'd actually wanted to know me and be part of my life, was overwhelming in a completely different way. All those years of feeling unwanted and overlooked, and there had been someone trying to reach me the entire time. The anger I'd been carrying toward my biological father shifted into something more complicated when I realized he'd probably been just as trapped and scared as everyone else, making choices as a teenager that had spiraled into this elaborate deception. But the biggest shock came when she asked if I'd like to spend some time getting to know each other, maybe start with coffee or lunch, something low pressure where we could talk about what I wanted going forward. The assumption had always been that I was settled and happy with my current living situation, that disrupting the family dynamic would be harmful and selfish. When I told her I'd been planning to leave anyway, that I'd discovered the truth about my parentage and had been feeling like an outsider in my own home, her expression changed completely. The careful diplomacy disappeared, replaced by something fiercer and more protective. She started asking questions about my experiences growing up, my relationship with each family member, how I'd been treated, and whether I'd felt loved and supported. The answers clearly weren't what she'd hoped to hear. By the end of our conversation, she was crying and apologizing for not fighting harder to stay in my life, for trusting that the arrangement was working for everyone when it obviously hadn't been working for me. She offered to help me with college applications, to let me stay with her while I figured out my next steps, to be the parent she'd always wanted to be if I was willing to give her the chance. It was the first time in my entire life that someone had put my needs and feelings first, had asked what I wanted instead of deciding what was best for everyone else. The relief was so intense it made me dizzy. Final update. I moved out 2 weeks later. Not dramatically, not with slamming doors or angry confrontations, just quietly packing my things while everyone was at work and school. I left a note explaining that I knew the truth about my parentage and that I'd made contact with my biological mother, that I'd be staying with her while I finished high school and applied for colleges. The note also said I didn't blame anyone for the choices they'd made when they were young and scared, but that I needed space to figure out who I was outside of the family dynamics that had defined my entire childhood. I thanked them for raising me and providing for me, but said I couldn't keep pretending everything was normal when it never had been. The response was mixed. Mom called crying, begging me to come home so we could work things out as a family. Dad sent carefully worded texts about being disappointed that I hadn't felt comfortable coming to them with questions or concerns. My biological father didn't reach out at all for several days, and when he finally did, it was just a short message saying he hoped I'd be happy and that he was sorry things had gotten so complicated. Living with my biological mother was like discovering I'd been holding my breath for 17 years without realizing it. She had a small apartment across town, nothing fancy but comfortable and peaceful. There were photos on her refrigerator of me at different ages, school pictures I'd never known she had, evidence that she'd been following my life from a distance all these years. She didn't try to immediately step into a traditional mother role, recognizing that we were essentially strangers who happened to share DNA and a complicated history. Instead, she focused on getting to know me as a person, asking about my interests and goals and opinions without any agenda or expectation. It was the first time anyone had seemed genuinely curious about my thoughts and feelings. The most healing part was learning about her side of the story, understanding that my existence hadn't been an unwanted mistake, but rather a complicated situation that had been handled poorly by everyone involved. She loved me from the moment she knew I existed, had grieved the loss of our relationship, and had never stopped hoping we'd have a chance to connect someday. She helped me apply for colleges and scholarships, drove me to interviews and campus visits, celebrated my acceptances with the kind of genuine enthusiasm I'd never experienced before. When graduation came, she was there in the audience taking pictures and cheering, making up for all the school events where I'd scanned the crowd hoping to see someone who was really there for me. My relationship with my original family has remained complicated. We exchange holiday cards and occasional updates, but the easy intimacy of daily life together was irreparably damaged by the years of deception and the revelation of truth. My biological father and I have had a few conversations as adults, awkward but honest discussions about how difficult the situation was for both of us. He's acknowledged that he took out his own fear and resentment on me in ways that weren't fair, that he was too young and scared to handle being a parent and too proud to admit he needed help. I've come to understand that the favoritism I experienced wasn't really about loving one child more than another, but about the adults involved trying to manage an impossible situation without any good options. The grandmother who raised me has struggled the most with my decision to leave and reconnect with my biological mother. She feels like her sacrifices and love have been rejected, like I'm ungrateful for everything she did to give me a stable home. It's taken years of careful conversations to help her understand that I'm grateful for her care while also needing to build relationships with my biological parents. Now, several years later, I'm in college studying something I'm passionate about, surrounded by friends who know the real story of my background and accept it without judgment. I have regular contact with my biological mother, who's become one of my closest confidants and strongest supporters. I send updates to my grandmother and biological father, maintaining connection without the toxic dynamics that made my childhood so difficult. The experience taught me that families are complicated, that love isn't always enough to overcome poor communication and hidden truths, and that sometimes the healthiest choice is to step away from situations that aren't working, even when they're all you've ever known. It also taught me that it's never too late to build authentic relationships based on honesty and mutual respect. Most importantly, I learned that my worth isn't determined by how other people treat me, that I deserve to be in relationships where I'm valued and wanted, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is leave behind what's familiar in search of what's healthy. The little boy who used to keep score of every slight and favoritism grew into an adult who understands that healing often requires distance, forgiveness takes time, and family can be chosen as well as inherited. I still think about that afternoon in the attic sometimes, how finding those documents felt like the end of the world but was actually the beginning of my real life. The truth was painful, but it was also liberating, freeing me from the exhausting effort of trying to earn love that was never really available and allowing me to find the relationships I'd been looking for all along.